You ever wake up and realize someone finally pushed you too far without even knowing it? The first thing I heard was the sharp slap of bare feet against cold concrete and a voice slicing through the quiet morning air like it owned the whole street. Where is my car? I didn't even need to look out the window to know it was Brenda Whitmore again. But I did anyway, pulling the curtain just enough to see her standing in the middle of the cul-de-sac in a silk robe, hair half done, phone in one hand, the other waving wildly at nothing because the one thing she was used to seeing, her white Lexus parked sideways across my driveway, was gone, completely gone, no glass, no tire marks, just a faint dark stain where it had sat like it belonged there, like my property was just an extension of hers, and I stood there holding my coffee, feeling the heat seep into my palm while the cool morning air slipped in through the cracked window. And for the first time in weeks, I could actually see my driveway clear from end to end, no obstruction, no smirk attached to it, no passive-aggressive note tucked under my windshield wiper, just space, clean, quiet space, and it almost didn't feel real, because for the past month, that strip of concrete had been less of a driveway and more of a battleground I never asked for. Every afternoon like clockwork Brenda would roll in slow, tires crunching over the curb just enough to remind me she knew exactly where the line was and chose to ignore it, hazard lights blinking like some kind of joke, and when I'd step outside and ask her, politely at first, if she could move so I could get out, she'd tilt her head, smile that thin, rehearsed smile, and say, "I'll just be a minute." Except a minute turned into 10, then 20, then full evenings where I'd sit in my truck watching the sun drop behind the houses because I literally couldn't leave, and every time I tried to push back, she'd bring up the HOA like it was some invisible badge she could flash, like rules only applied when she said they did. And I remember one morning, missing a towing job that would have covered half my week's bills because I couldn't get out in time, and she was out there sipping coffee like none of it mattered, like my time didn't count, like I didn't, and that was the moment something shifted, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet click in the back of my mind. The kind that doesn't show up in your voice or your face, but starts writing a plan anyway. And from that day on I stopped arguing, stopped knocking on her door, stopped giving her anything to push against. I just watched, measured, documented, the angle of her tires, the timestamps on my phone. The way her car always crossed that exact line where my property began. I installed a small camera under the eave, nothing obvious, just enough to catch everything clearly. I put up a clean sign right by the driveway entrance, bold letters, no nonsense. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed at owner's expense. And I made sure it was visible from the street, not hidden, not arguable, and every time she parked there after that, I said nothing, just added another entry to the list, another clip to the folder, another piece of a story she didn't even realize she was helping me build. And last night, when I pulled in late, headlights washing over that same white Lexus blocking me again like it always did, music drifting from down the street, laughter spilling into the night air, I didn't feel angry, not anymore. I just checked the time, glanced at the camera feed on my phone, and made a single call, calm, clear, precise. And then I went inside, shut the door, and let the night handle the rest. So now as Brenda stands out there spinning in circles, calling anyone who'll listen, trying to figure out how something she thought she controlled just vanished, I take a slow sip of coffee and finally step outside. Because what she still doesn't understand is this was never about the car. It was about the moment she decided I didn't have a say. And the moment I decided she was wrong, I did not answer Brenda when she started shouting my name, because I knew exactly how this part would go. I had seen it coming long before this morning, long before the empty space where her car used to sit. Because people like Brenda do not suddenly realize they are wrong. They escalate first, they accuse, they demand, and right on cue she turned and spotted me standing at the edge of my driveway, coffee still in hand, and marched over like she was stepping onto a stage she believed she owned, her voice sharp and loud enough for every neighbor behind every curtain to hear, asking me if I saw anything, if I heard anything, if I knew who would do something like this, and I kept my expression calm, steady, the same way I had trained myself over the past few weeks every time she tested me, every time she blocked me in and smiled like she was waiting for me to explode, but I never gave her that. I just shook my head slowly and said I had no idea, and that only made her more frantic, because what she expected was resistance. What she expected was an argument she could twist, But silence does something different. It forces people to hear themselves. And she started pacing, heels clicking against the pavement now that she had slipped them on, calling someone on her phone, probably the HOA, probably trying to turn this into a violation she could pin on anyone but herself. And as she spoke, I noticed something almost funny. She kept gesturing toward my driveway, toward the exact spot she had treated like her personal parking space for weeks. And now that it was empty, now that it was finally mine again, she did not know where to stand, like the ground had shifted under her in a way she could not control. And that was the thing about all of this. It was never just about a car. It was about control. About the quiet assumption that she could take up space that was not hers and nothing would happen, that the rules bend around her because she said so. And I remembered every small detail that led here. Every time she parked just a few inches further over the line. Every time she told me I was overreacting. Every time she used that tone that made it sound like I was the inconvenience, not her. And I remembered the night I sat in my truck for 40 minutes watching her laugh with her friends, while I waited for my own driveway to clear, engine idling, gas ticking away, patience stretching thinner than it should have ever needed to. And that was when I stopped reacting and started preparing. I measured the width of the driveway down to the inch. I checked the local ordinances twice to make sure I understood exactly what qualified as obstruction. I made sure the sign I installed was positioned where no one could claim they did not see it, bold lettering, reflective enough to catch headlights at night. And I tested the camera angle until it captured the full approach. The tires crossing the line, the timestamp clear and undeniable, and every clip I recorded was not for revenge. Not really. It was for clarity. For a moment exactly like this where everything would line up and speak for itself. And now here we were, Brenda still pacing, still raising her voice, still trying to pull the neighborhood into her version of the story, and one by one doors began to open. People stepping out, curious, cautious, drawn by the noise, and I could feel the shift already. The difference between hearing complaints and seeing consequences, because an empty space tells a louder story than any argument ever could. And when she finally stopped in front of me again, eyes narrowed, voice lower but sharper, asking if I was sure I did not call anyone, I met her gaze, and for the first time I did not feel the need to explain myself, because everything that mattered had already been set in motion hours ago, quietly, legally, precisely. And the truth was sitting just a few miles away in a secured lot with a printed receipt waiting to be claimed. And as the morning sun crept higher and lit up the clean stretch of concrete behind me, I realized something simple and steady. This was the first time since I moved here that my driveway actually felt like it belonged to me. And Brenda was just now beginning to understand what that meant. By the time Brenda's voice started cracking from shouting into her phone, I could already hear the shift in the neighborhood. Not loud, not obvious, just the quiet murmur of people stepping outside, watching, piecing things together for themselves. And I leaned against the edge of my garage, arms relaxed, letting the moment stretch, because this was the part no one ever sees. The part where everything that happened before finally starts connecting in other people's heads. And I caught Mr. Alvarez from 2 houses down squinting at the empty space, then at Brenda, then back at the clearly posted sign at the end of my driveway. The same sign that had been there for days, maybe weeks. And it hit me that this was the first time anyone had actually noticed it. Not because it was new, but because now it mattered. Now there was a consequence attached to it, and Brenda was still talking, still trying to control the narrative, saying words like stolen and illegal and threatening to get lawyers involved. But every sentence she said sounded thinner than the last, because reality does not bend just because someone raises their voice. And I remembered exactly how this all built up, the small things that seemed easy to ignore at first, like the way she would roll in slowly, checking her mirrors not to avoid crossing the line, but to make sure she landed exactly where she wanted, the front tire just over my driveway. The back tire angled enough to block me in completely, precise, intentional, like she had practiced it. And I remembered the first time I pointed it out to her, how she laughed, not loudly, just enough to make it clear she did not take me seriously, and said I was being dramatic, that there was plenty of space, even though there was not, even though I had to inch my truck out at a risky angle just to avoid scraping the curb. And each time after that, the pattern repeated, except she got more comfortable, more confident, like every time I chose patience she read it as permission. And that is the part people misunderstand about patience. They think it means weakness. They think it means nothing is happening. But what they do not see is the quiet accumulation, the details stacking up, the decisions being made without any noise at all. And I could see that misunderstanding written all over Brenda's face right now as she finally lowered her phone and looked at me again, searching for something. Maybe guilt, maybe panic, something she could use. And when she did not find it, her expression hardened, and she stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough so it felt more direct, more personal, asking me one more time if I was sure I had nothing to do with it. And I let a small breath out. Not annoyed, not defensive, just steady, and told her I had been very clear about the sign, about the driveway, about needing access. And that was the truth. I had said it, more than once, calmly, directly, without any threats, and I could see it click, not fully, but enough, a flicker of realization that maybe this was not random, maybe this was not something she could just talk her way out of. And around us the neighborhood stayed quiet but attentive, doors half open, people lingering just long enough to witness. And that was when her phone buzzed again, sharp and loud in the still air, and she answered it immediately, voice shifting from anger to urgency. And I watched her face change as she listened, the tension tightening around her eyes, the confidence slipping just a little more. And even though I could not hear the other side of the call, I already knew what was being said. I knew the tone, the explanation, the calm, procedural language that does not leave room for interpretation. And as she turned slightly away, pacing again but slower now, I took another sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in, because everything that was happening right now was not sudden. It was not luck. It was the result of every quiet decision I made when I chose not to react, when I chose to understand the rules better than the person trying to use them against me. And as the morning light spread across the now empty driveway, clean and unobstructed, I realized that for the first time, Brenda was the one trying to catch up to something that had already been set in motion long before she even noticed it. The change in Brenda's face was subtle at first, like she was trying to hold on to control by force of habit. But I saw it in the way her shoulders stiffened and her pacing slowed as the voice on the other end of the call kept talking, steady, professional, not reacting to her tone at all. And that is when people like her start to lose ground, not when someone argues back, but when the system they rely on does not bend for them. And she turned slightly, back half toward me now, lowering her voice like that might somehow change what she was hearing, repeating questions, asking for clarification, throwing in phrases like, that cannot be right, and you must be mistaken. But the more she spoke, the more it became clear that nothing on the other end was changing, and I watched as her eyes flicked toward my driveway again, toward the sign, toward the clean line where her car used to sit. And I knew exactly what detail had just clicked into place for her, because that was the same moment it had clicked for me weeks ago when I first read through the local ordinance word for word, the part that defined obstruction, the part that outlined enforcement, the part that made it very clear that once proper notice was given, the outcome was not personal, it was procedural, and procedures do not care about who you think you are. And as she ended the call, slowly, carefully, like she was buying herself time to think, the street stayed quiet in that way that only happens when everyone is listening without pretending they are not. And she turned back toward me again, this time, not shouting, not pacing, just standing there, eyes narrowed but searching, recalculating, and I could almost see the questions lining up in her mind, not about what happened, but about how it happened without her stopping it. And that was the part she was not used to, not being the one in control of the situation, not being able to redirect it with a louder voice or a sharper tone. And when she finally spoke, it was different, still firm, still edged with frustration, but missing that layer of certainty she had carried before, asking me if I had called a tow company. And I did not rush to answer, not to be dramatic, not to make a point, just because I did not need to rush anymore. And I nodded once, simple, direct, and told her that I followed the posted notice and the local guidelines. Nothing more, nothing less. And that answer hung in the air longer than anything I could have said if I tried to explain it. Because it was not an argument, it was a statement of fact, and facts do not leave much room to maneuver. And she exhaled sharply, looking past me, scanning the houses, the people, the space like she was trying to find an angle she could still use. But there was not one, not anymore. And I remembered the night before in sharper detail now. The way the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. The way the air felt cooler than usual as I stepped out of my truck and saw her car sitting there again, blocking me in like it had every other time. And how quiet everything felt when I did not knock on her door, when I did not call out, when I just stood there for a second, listening to the distant music from down the block, smelling the faint mix of grass and asphalt, and then pulled out my phone, checked the camera feed, confirmed the time, and made that one call, calm, clear, no hesitation, and within minutes the process started, not loud, not chaotic, just efficient, headlights approaching, equipment set, everything done by the book, and I had stood there off to the side, watching without saying a word as the car that had taken up my space for weeks was finally moved without argument, without negotiation, just a result of the conditions that had already been met, and now, standing here in the morning light, I could see that moment catching up to Brenda in real time, piece by piece. And for the first time since all of this started, she did not have a response ready. She did not have a quick remark or a dismissive smile. Just a long pause and a glance back at the empty stretch of concrete that no longer belonged to her routine, and in that silence, something shifted in a way that no argument ever could, because this was not about winning a conversation, it was about changing the pattern, and patterns only break when something real forces them to. Brenda did not yell this time, and that was how I knew the weight of it had finally settled in, not all at once, but enough to change the way she stood there, arms crossed tighter than before, eyes moving between me, the sign, and the driveway like she was trying to find something she missed, some technicality, some detail she could still use to flip this back in her favor. And for a moment, she opened her mouth like she was about to argue again, but nothing came out, and that silence said more than anything she had shouted earlier, because it meant she was thinking, really thinking. And people like Brenda do not do that unless they have to. And I could feel the neighborhood leaning into that silence too. The subtle shift of attention from curiosity to understanding, because this was no longer just noise, it was a sequence, a cause and effect playing out in front of them, and I caught a few glances from across the street, not confrontational, just observant, like they were putting together their own version of events based on what they had seen over the past few weeks, and that was something Brenda could not control either, the quiet memory of other people, the times they had seen her car parked there, the times they had seen me waiting, the pattern that had been visible if anyone had looked closely enough, and now that pattern had a result attached to it, something tangible, something that could not be dismissed as overreaction or misunderstanding. And she shifted her weight again, adjusting her stance like she was trying to regain some footing, and finally she spoke, slower now, asking where her car was taken, and I told her the name of the tow company, clear, simple, the same one listed on the sign. And that seemed to land harder than anything else, because it confirmed that this was not random, not personal in the way she wanted it to be. It was exactly what the notice said would happen, nothing more, nothing less, and she pulled her phone back up, typing quickly, probably searching, probably calling again, trying to get ahead of it. But I knew what she was going to hear because I had already heard it the night before, the explanation, the fees, the location, the process to retrieve the vehicle. All of it laid out in terms that do not change based on tone or attitude, and as she listened, her expression tightened again, not with anger this time, but with something closer to disbelief, like she was still expecting the situation to correct itself without her having to accept it. And I remembered that feeling in a different way, not disbelief, but the moment I realized that nothing was going to change unless I stopped hoping it would, the night I sat in my truck watching the clock tick past another missed job, calculating what that delay would cost me, not just in money, but in reputation, in trust, and how small it made me feel to be blocked in by something so avoidable, something that should have been simple respect. And that was when I decided that waiting for someone else to do the right thing was not a strategy, it was just a delay. And standing here now, watching Brenda come to terms with the outcome of that decision, I felt none of the frustration that used to sit in my chest, just a steady calm. The kind that comes from knowing exactly how things unfolded and why. And she ended the call again, slower this time, her shoulders dropping just slightly. And for a second she looked past me at the driveway, really looked at it, not as a convenience, not as an extension of her space, but as something separate, something defined. And that was the shift, small but real. And she let out a breath, quieter now, almost under her breath, talking about fees, about how ridiculous it was, about how this should not have happened. But even those words lacked the force they had before, because deep down she knew it was not sudden, it was not unfair, it was the natural result of something she had chosen to ignore over and over again. And I stayed where I was, not moving, not adding anything, because there was nothing left to add. Everything that needed to be said had already been set in place long before this morning. And as the sun climbed a little higher, casting a clean line of light across the driveway that was finally clear, I realized that the most important part of all of this was not the car being gone. It was the fact that the pattern had been broken, and for the first time since this started, there was no question about where the line was or what happened when it was crossed. Brenda stood there a little longer than she probably meant to, like her body had not caught up with what her mind was starting to accept, and for a second I thought she might say something else, something sharp or dismissive to reclaim the space she had just lost. But instead she just nodded once, almost to herself, and turned back toward her house with a stiffness in her step that had not been there before, and as she walked away, the street slowly started to breathe again. Doors easing closed, conversations fading into low murmurs, people retreating back into their routines now that the moment had passed. But I could still feel it lingering, that quiet awareness that something had shifted in a way that would not easily go back. And I stayed where I was for a minute longer, letting the silence settle properly this time. No shouting, no engines idling, no blocked exit forcing me to wait, just the faint hum of a normal morning returning to its place. And I looked down the length of my driveway again, from the garage all the way out to the street, clean, unobstructed, exactly how it should have always been. And it struck me how something so simple had taken so much patience to restore, not because it was complicated, but because it required me to stop reacting and start thinking differently. And I remembered the first few days after I put up the sign, how nothing changed at all, how Brenda parked there anyway, like the sign did not apply to her, like it was just another suggestion she could ignore. And I almost gave in then, almost went back to knocking on her door, asking, explaining, trying to fix it through conversation again. But I did not, because by that point I understood something I had missed before, that repeating the same approach and expecting a different result was just another way of delaying the outcome. And instead I stayed consistent. Every time she parked there I recorded it. Every time I needed to leave and could not, I noted the time, the duration, the impact, building a record that did not rely on memory or opinion, just facts lined up one after another. And it was not dramatic, it was not satisfying in the moment. It was quiet work, the kind no one sees until it matters. And now standing here, watching Brenda's front door close with a softer sound than usual, I could see exactly why that mattered. Because when the moment came, there was no confusion. No gray area, no room for interpretation, just a clear sequence that led to a clear result. And I finally took a step forward, walking down the driveway, without having to angle my shoulders, or check the curb, or calculate whether I had enough space. Just a straight line from my garage to the street. And it felt different in a way that is hard to explain unless you have had something small taken from you over and over again. Not enough to seem serious to anyone else, but enough to build up over time until it changes how you move, how you think, how you plan your day. And as I reached the end and looked out at the street, I noticed the faint marks where the tow truck had been the night before, subtle lines in the dust, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. And I paused there for a second, not out of hesitation, but recognition, because that was the exact point where everything had shifted, not with noise or confrontation, but with a decision followed through to the end. And I could still picture it clearly, the quiet efficiency, the way the situation resolved itself once the right conditions were met. And that was the part that stayed with me the most. Not the removal of the car, but the fact that it happened. Without conflict, without escalation, just a direct result of actions taken over time. And as I turned back toward the house, I realized that this was not about teaching Brenda a lesson in the way people usually think about it. It was about resetting a boundary in a way that could not be ignored, and boundaries only hold when they are enforced consistently, not loudly, not emotionally, just consistently. And for the first time since all of this started, I felt something settle into place, not relief exactly, but a steady sense that things were now aligned the way they should have been from the beginning. And whatever happened next, whatever Brenda chose to do after this, would have to exist within that new reality, Not the one she had been used to before. The rest of that day moved differently. Like the street itself had adjusted to something new even if no one said it out loud. And I noticed it in small ways first. The kind of details you only pick up when you have been paying attention for too long. Like how no cars slowed near my driveway anymore, as if considering it an option. How the space stayed clear even as the afternoon filled with visitors and deliveries. And how Brenda's side of the street stayed unusually quiet. Her front door opening once, then closing again. No music, no voices spilling out. Just a stillness that felt deliberate. And I went about my day the way I always did, checking my truck, organizing tools, lining up my next jobs. But there was a difference in the rhythm. No interruptions, no mental calculation about whether I would be blocked in when I needed to leave. Just a clean flow from one task to the next, and it struck me how much energy I had been spending around that one problem without fully realizing it. Adjusting my schedule, leaving earlier than necessary, building in extra time just in case. All because someone else had decided my space was optional. And now that it was no longer happening, that extra weight was just gone, not dramatically, not with some big sense of victory, just quietly removed, like it had never belonged there in the first place. And around late afternoon, I stepped outside again, the sun lower, now casting longer shadows across the pavement, and I saw Brenda's driveway empty, which was unusual in itself, because her car was almost always somewhere nearby, often exactly where it should not have been. And for a moment, I wondered how the rest of her day had gone. The drive out to the tow lot, the conversation at the counter, the moment she had to hear the total cost, the explanation of why it happened. And I knew that process would have been just as calm and procedural as the call that set it in motion. No raised voices changing anything. Just a clear list of steps she had to follow to get her car back. And I did not feel satisfaction in the way people expect. There was no rush, no need to see her reaction to that part of it, because the outcome itself was enough. And as I stood there, a delivery van rolled slowly down the street, pausing near my driveway for a second before continuing on. And I caught the driver's glance at the sign, quick, automatic, understanding, and that was the difference. Not fear, not tension, just clarity. And it made everything simpler for everyone involved. And I leaned back against the garage frame, listening to the faint sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening, distant lawn equipment shutting off, a dog barking once and then stopping, the low hum of traffic further out, all of it steady, predictable. And for the first time in a while, my attention was not split between what I was doing and what might happen next with Brenda, because there was no uncertainty left to manage. The boundary had been set in a way that did not require constant reinforcement through words. And as the light continued to fade, I noticed something else. A pair of headlights turning onto the street, moving slowly, cautiously, and for a brief second I thought it might be her returning, testing the line again. But the car passed by without even pausing, continuing down to the next house. And I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, not from worry, but from habit. And that was when it really settled in. The pattern was not just broken for one moment. It was replaced with something new, something stable. And that is the part people overlook. It is not enough to stop a problem once. You have to change the conditions that allowed it to happen in the first place. And now those conditions were gone, clearly defined, clearly understood, and I stepped forward again, walking the length of the driveway one more time as the last of the daylight slipped away, the concrete still warm under my shoes, the air cooling just enough to carry that familiar evening scent of grass and asphalt. And I knew that whatever Brenda chose to do next, whether she adjusted or resisted, it would no longer catch me off guard, because this time I was not reacting to her actions. I was operating within a system I had already set, and that system did not depend on her behavior to hold. The streetlights flickered on one by one as evening settled in, casting that soft amber glow across the pavement. And I was halfway through closing up my garage when I heard the low hum of an engine turning into the cul-de-sac again, slower this time, deliberate. And I did not need to look up right away to know it was Brenda returning, because there was a different kind of hesitation in the way the car rolled forward, like every inch of movement had to be reconsidered. And when I finally glanced over, I saw the white Lexus again, clean, untouched, exactly as it had been before, except now it carried something it did not have before, awareness. And she eased it down the street, passing my driveway without even slowing. Not even a glance toward the space she used to take for granted. And that moment was quiet but unmistakable, because it confirmed what the morning had already set in motion. The pattern was not just interrupted, it was replaced, and she pulled into her own driveway this time, straight, centered, careful in a way that felt almost unfamiliar coming from her. And when she stepped out, she did not slam the door or call out or try to draw attention. She just stood there for a second, looking at the street, at the houses, at everything except me, and I could tell she knew people had seen what happened, not just the missing car, but the reason behind it, the sequence, the logic that could not be argued away. And she walked inside without a word, the door closing with a quiet click. That carried more weight than any shouting from earlier that morning. And I finished closing the garage, the metal door rolling down with a steady hum, sealing in the day like it had finally reached a proper end. And as I stepped back out onto the driveway one last time, I noticed how natural it felt now, how there was no tension in checking the street, no instinct to anticipate someone else's decision overriding mine, just a clear line from where I stood to where I needed to go. And I took a slow breath, the air cooler now, carrying that mix of evening stillness and distant sounds that settle into the background when nothing is demanding your attention. And I realized something that had not been obvious before. This was never about making a scene or proving a point in front of people. It was about restoring something simple in a way that could not be undone by the next conversation or the next excuse. And that is why it worked, because it did not rely on Brenda agreeing with me or understanding me or even respecting me in the moment. It relied on a structure that existed whether she liked it or not. And as the night deepened and the neighborhood quieted, I saw a couple of cars pass by, each one slowing just enough to read the sign at the edge of my driveway before continuing on. No hesitation, no confusion, just a small adjustment based on clear information. And that was all it ever needed to be: simple, visible, consistent. And I turned back toward the house, pausing at the threshold for a second, glancing over my shoulder at the driveway one more time. The concrete now a muted gray under the streetlight, completely empty, completely mine, and it felt different in a way that did not need to be explained. Not louder, not bigger, just settled, like something that had been out of place was finally returned to where it belonged. And as I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I knew that whatever Brenda thought about all of this, whatever story she told herself to make sense of it, would not change what had already been established, because the real shift had nothing to do with her reaction. It had everything to do with the fact that the next time she, or anyone else, looked at that driveway, they would not see an opportunity. They would see a boundary that held. The next morning did not come with shouting or footsteps or anything sharp cutting through the air. It came quietly, the way normal mornings are supposed to, sunlight easing across the driveway in a slow, steady line, the kind that does not demand attention but fills the space anyway. And I stepped outside with my coffee out of habit more than anything, half expecting something to be off, some new angle, some attempt to test what had been set the day before. But everything was still, exactly as it should be. And that was when I understood the real ending to all of this was not loud. It was this, the absence of conflict where there used to be a pattern of it. And across the street Brenda's house was quiet, her car parked correctly in her own driveway, centered, aligned, untouched. And there was no hesitation in the way I walked down my own driveway this time, no glance toward her side, no calculation, just a straight path forward. And I realized that what had changed was not just her behavior, it was mine, because I was no longer reacting, no longer waiting to see what she would do. I had already defined what would happen if the line was crossed again. And that clarity does something subtle but powerful. It removes uncertainty. And without uncertainty, there is nothing left for someone like Brenda to push against. And as the morning settled in, a few neighbors passed by, casual nods, small acknowledgments, nothing direct, but enough to show they had seen, they understood, and they were not questioning it. Because there was nothing to question, and that was the part that stayed with me the most. Not the moment her car was taken, not the look on her face, but the fact that everything afterward aligned naturally without any effort, because it had been built on something solid from the start. And I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth settle as I looked out at the street, clean, quiet, predictable again. And I thought back to the first time she blocked me in, how small it seemed, how easy it was to brush off, how I told myself it was not worth making an issue over. and how that decision, repeated over and over, turned something small into something that controlled my time, my work, my space, and the shift only happened when I stopped treating it like a moment and started treating it like a pattern. And once I saw it that way, the solution became clear, not immediate, not dramatic, but inevitable, because patterns can only continue if they are allowed to, and the moment they are met with something consistent, something structured, they either change or they stop. And as I stood there in the quiet, watching the sunlight fully reach the end of the driveway, I understood that nothing about what happened was sudden, nothing about it was luck. It was the result of patience applied the right way, not passive, not avoidant, but deliberate. And that is the part people miss when they think about justice. They expect it to be loud, to be immediate, to feel like a confrontation. But most of the time it is none of those things. It is quiet, it builds over time, and when it arrives, it does not need to announce itself because everything already points to it. And I turned back toward the house, setting my empty cup down by the door, taking one last look at the driveway as it sat there exactly as it should, untouched, respected, defined, and I let a small breath out. Not relief, not triumph, just a steady acknowledgement of what had been set in place. Because in the end, nothing disappeared overnight except the assumption that someone else could decide how my space was used. And once that was gone, everything else fell exactly where it belonged.